Welcome to the channel. In this video, we're going to be taking a look at Community Report 57 for Workers and Resources Soviet Republic. This was published on the 22nd of August 2022. This report consists of two parts. The first part, the devs give us an update with respect to when we can expect the new update to go into the beta test branch. They also talk about a couple of pretty interesting new features, which I want to go through. And the second part of the report is another update with respect to the new import export model that was discussed in the previous video, and it does go into some considerable depth with respect to the mechanic, which is useful if you're interested in it. But if you're not interested or you're new to the game, what I suggest is that when I give you the warning that we're about to enter that section, just skip the rest of the video, guys, because it is very involved. But if any of you are advanced players, it is a very interesting subject. Give my congratulations to the person who produced this report. But they've made a pretty good attempt at trying to clarify a few issues. Anyway, let's just get into the first part of the report. It says, greetings, dear comrades of the Soviet Republic. Another heat wave has arrived in Central Europe, and that does not mean that they will slow us down in delivering the upcoming update. As we release the Metro update into internal testing this week, our development team is on fire, but in a good way, doing their best to fix as much issues that they can, because they want to release this update before the end of August for public testing. That's brilliant. Even if that will not be the final release, it will make the update available for most players. We already have plenty of bug reports to deal with, and because the most people participate in testing, more unconventional ways they play can be used to reveal potential issues. The main problem always is that with each change in the code, there's a change that typos and oversights may happen, which are easy to miss when checking the code, and you can only see the mistakes when the features are being used, even when then somebody needs to notice that something is not as it should be. Yeah, I can sympathize with the devs. I remember my days when I was actually coding, and it was nothing more frustrating than having a piece of code or a feature not working, and you spend hours going through the code, looking at it, trying to work out the logic, and it goes wrong. And then you get a colleague come up behind you and look over your shoulder, and you're talking about it, and they say, there you are, you've missed out a bracket, or that bracket there is in the wrong place. But then again, I've done it to my co-workers as well. So we're just going to move down. I'll skip over the picture for the moment. There's the last bits we wanted to add to the metro infrastructure were the above ground metro stations. Some of the people may be interested in use them, even if they use bridges, which they will need to connect them and may be a bit more expensive. On the other hand, this may offer you a way on how to have a nice above ground with a spectacular view. The only issue that you may face is that you may need to use an underground end station. Well, that is so that not the whole line can be above ground, as you also need the depots to be on the ground. So I'm not exactly sure, but that will become apparent once we can start playing with it. Let's have a quick look at the picture. It's pretty cool. Probably use it for the fun now. Now, I don't know if you can see, but behind the second station there, the track drops down and then swings round to the left. So I think this has got the potential to have a mixture of underground, along ground, and above ground public transport, which means you can move across things. That also means that you could possibly connect longer distances rather than using tunnels, using an overground. I quite like that, actually. And then we're just taking a look at the pictures. Yeah, I think probably if I was doing an overground, I'd probably use the smaller station. You can see you can actually connect the bridges in straight away. And we've got a couple of pictures here. I'll just show you a couple of them. So, I mean, that looks pretty cool, actually, across the elevated runway. And then you'll be able to get roads and stuff underneath as well. Let's have a look here. There's another view there. Looks like you'll be able to use different... that's the station, isn't it? Yeah, I'm really liking that, actually. We're just going to move down to the next paragraph. There were several minor changes also introduced before the game was released for public testing. I'm assuming that's public internal testing. You can now see how much money you're allowed to borrow. The limits is dependent on the number of workers you have, as we value the potential of each worker that as more than economic numbers for your republic may output. Scalability with growth and inflation is not too complicated then. So this is just confirming a change which they talked about in the previous report, where there will be limits on loans, and the amount you can borrow will now be dependent on how many workers you've got. You can now have longer city names, and your cities will not be flooded with pedestrian crossings because they will be placed on the road only if there is a pathway connected on both sides. And that's this picture down here. So we'll just show you this. So you can see here now we won't get loads and loads of pedestrian crosses now. That's pretty cool. Be interesting to see whether residents will still jaywalk, but that's something we can look at. And so pick up the next sentence. Sorry, I'm doing this sentence by sentence, but I think it's more relevant because there's a series of little bits and pieces. There's another small and useful change will be that you can set vehicles to be unlocked according to their production start year, and they will not become locked afterwards. What this means is that at the moment there's two options when you set up a game. You can either have all your vehicles unlocked, so all the vehicles are available from the get-go, or you've got the other option where you can vehicles only come available when their production date starts. The downside of that is that most vehicles, especially modded vehicles, have a lifespan, and then once that lifespan's up, you lose it. This is a particular problem if you do a very early start, say like a 1900 start, because some of the early mods only have a lifespan of 4 or 5 years, which is a little bit frustrating because I mean, vehicles go on past that. So what the devs have done is put in an option so that when a vehicle becomes available, it stays available. Probably with respect to the 1960 start, this would be useful, but it's not the end of the world. But I think if you plan on doing a really early start, 1900, 1910, this is quite a big game changer. It's going to make life a lot easier. I'm just going to read the last sentence. Then we also allowed you to buy containers at customs, so you do not need to make your own nuclear fuel for customer nuclear power anymore. So this is this top picture, and it's quite interesting actually because you've got the option here, containers, which is to purchase road vehicles, and they mention nuclear fuel, which is these casks down here. So you don't have to actually produce the fuel, you can actually produce the intermediate products as well by the look of it. But more interestingly is you've got a container that's got mechanical components in, plastics, and more importantly electronics. Now I think this could be very useful because one of the frustrations I get is that when you're trying to import electronics is that you can get either too little or too much. I think having containers to bring goods in, I'm assuming that these containers can be in some way, I'm not sure, but it'd be certainly something that would be worth looking at, especially when you start out in the early game. So we're now going to move down to the next paragraph. Now this paragraph is a bit odd, and I'll try and kind of get through it and then I'll talk about it afterwards. It says, for bigger changes we've made, the fuel consumption formula changes worth mentioning with a short commentary. Now that the consumption of vehicles will be more dependent on their weight, category, power, top speed and actual speed. What does that mean? Vehicles with weaker engines have lower fuel consumption. Also, vehicle driving slower, for example, on gravel or prefab road, will now have lower fuel consumption than a vehicle driving full speed on an asphalt road. Technically, it is counting in the air drag a vehicle needs to face when driving faster. There is a way to add vehicle current load into the formula, but it was not done yet because we want to see how this change will affect the overall fuel consumption. One important thing to mention that is that driving range, how much a vehicle can do on one gas tank before it needs to refuel. For personal cars will be reduced by 40% due to the lower capacity of their fuel tanks. Other vehicles have a bit lower driving range too, but it can be tweaked if necessary, adding to it. So what are the numbers? After doing some tests, we found the overall consumption of vehicles dropped by 10 to 15%. For vehicles driving during winter on unmaintained roads, it could be even 40% of the respective period. But that means that you will save fuel compared to previous fuel consumption formula anyway. But you will have to consider if it's really want to use that 500 kilowatt truck from the workshop with 160 kilometers top speed instead of the weaker 250 kilometers with 100 kilometers top speed. Now the picture before, I won't show it to you, I'll show it to you very briefly. It's just an example of different types of vehicles. It doesn't really convey anything about the fuel consumption as far as I can tell. It's just kind of giving an example of different types of truck and their carry capacity. So like you've got this one, it does 82 kilometers an hour, can carry kind of roughly about 2 tons, 3 tons of crops. This one does 80. It's got a bit more carry capacity, 3.5, 4 tons of crops. I think that with the reduced fuel consumption will be quite useful because if you're playing on a map with limited oil, that will be effective. I think probably the main outcome of this change is that there's a habit, and I'll put my hand up and say I'm guilty of this, that you tend to just buy the biggest, say, covered whole truck and then just use it to carry everything. I think what this consumption change will do is make it a bit more viable to use smaller trucks and actually match trucks to what they're going to do. Now, we've now reached the point in this report where things get pretty involved and quite technical. And as I said in the intro, if you're not interested in the import export thresholds and the effect it's going to have on price, especially if you're a new player, this is probably the point to leave the video. And if you've come this far, thank you for watching. And for any of you who want to know more detail, what I will say is I will go through this and I will try and round out and talk about and give you a few examples. But if you really want to get down into this and really sort it out in your own head, what I suggest is that you just get a copy of the report and read it through yourself, because I've read this 3 times just to try and get it clear in my head, and I think I've got it clear. But so that out of the way, for any of you who want to stay with me, here we go. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to read through paragraphs, and we'll be moving up and down a little bit, and I'll be trying to kind of explain things as I go along. So this is starting the paragraphs. This next thing we want to write about is a bit of the latest changes for price calculation formula. We read the feedback and the explanation was quite generic, but difficult to understand. Because of that, we want to give a few examples now to show you what happens with the price if you buy or sell certain resources in certain amount, to allow you to see the consequences. There are a few important points we need to take into consideration. The spreadsheet we showed you contained numbers of thresholds for each resource in their respective amount, tons, megawatts, cubic meters, etc. And that is the limit when the calculation for price change switches from linear to exponential. So to keep maximum profits and not overpay too much, you need to stay below the number for the last 75 days. And then you need to know when you export the amount of resources from the spreadsheet in the period, the price amount should be plus or 5% depending on what kind of trade it is. But there may be slight deviations as inflation is calculated every 5 days, and then some global events may affect the price. Basically what the devs are saying is, if I show you, we've got a spreadsheet down here, but there are a couple of links, so I'm just going to open the spreadsheet. This is the spreadsheet that was in the previous report. What the devs are saying is that what you've got is this spreadsheet for each resource there, and for each currency there will be a import export threshold. So if we say for, well, it's just gravel, you can export up to 1,500 tons of gravel every 75 days, because this is the calculation period, which gives you a gravel export of 5,800 tons per year. And then the next column is 2,400 tons imported. Now that could be quite an interesting factor, but that's for 75 days, which means you can import 11,680 tons of gravel per year without incurring an extra cost. If you go above this threshold, the price will start to rise if you're importing, and of course it will start to drop if you're exporting. That's it. Yeah, just get it right in the head. And of course, what you've got over here is corresponding values for dollars, and you can see they're quite similar. And you can go down. I'm not going to go through them all, but I mean, looking through these thresholds, some of them are quite interesting. I think there's a slight orientation towards possibly potential cheap products, which I think they're going to go on and mention, but I'll just mention it quickly, which is importing fabric to make clothes for exports, and of course importing food to make importing crops to make food to export as well. And I think these have been intentionally put down lower than normal. But at the same time, like if you look at electronics, we've got an export of electronics of 250 every 75 days. Now, I'm going to be completely upfront. If you can build an economy that can supply electronics to your entire economy and still be able to export 1,217 tons of electronics, you're a far better player than me. But more importantly, over here, you can see we'll be able to import 487 tons of electronics in rubles. And again, that doesn't sound much, but if you're having to import 487 tons of electronics every year, that is a very big bill. Even 100 tons every 75 days, which works out roughly, what's it, 2.5 months. So you're you're probably importing about 30 tons a month. Once you get into the late economy, you could be talking then you having to pay 30 million a month just for the electronics. So, and also another interesting one down here is water usage. And I think this is an attempt to possibly close a little bit of an exploit where you can import water and export sewage to the border in the early game. Anyway, I just don't want to labor that too much because the devs are going to fill in a little bit more information here. So we're just going to go back up to this next paragraph here. It says, next thing you need to know is that the threshold scales. If you do not have any workers, your threshold for all imports and exports is lowered by 50% of its value, and you get 50% of the value for each 25,000 workers living in your republic. That means that you'll have lower profit margin for exports without having your own workers in certain situations, and you will pay more for excessive imports of resources. You can do the math by yourself to calculate how much resources do you need to import, and how much you will cost by recalculating the threshold to a year, which has 365 days a year. The next important thing is that the resource traded through the aerial waterway customs have 3 times value of the standard threshold to lower the price fluctuations there, and you will want to trade with the vast numbers. And what that paragraph basically is saying is that these thresholds, say for example, well, just choose one, say steel, that is based on a situation where you have a population of 25,000 people. Now, I'll explain this in a little bit more depth later on, but if you're exporting by ship or plane, that is triple to 6,000 tons of steel. So hopefully that makes sense. Now, to try and give you a bit of an explanation of what that actually means, I'm going to skip this paragraph first and come down to the formula, and then we'll go back to the paragraph and then see if that will make a bit more sense. What this is, the formula for calculating the actual threshold calculations. So what you will see is it says that the actual threshold is the threshold times 0.5. That is the condition for no workers. That means the threshold is cut in half, plus the threshold times the number of workers divided by 50. So what you've got is the threshold, say, for example, let's keep it, let's use the example that we're going to be looking at, fabric. So the import threshold is 350. So it'd be 350 divided by 5 and multiplied by 5, which is equivalent to divided by 2, which is 175. Now, and then you've got 350 divided by, say, 25,000 divided 50, which is a half. And that's the proof of what I was saying about the fact that this threshold, sorry about jumping backwards and forwards, guys, but I'm trying to keep it clear in my own head here, of 350 for food comes from the fact that you have a population of 25,000. Now, it means that if you have a population less than 25,000 or between 0 and 25,000, your threshold will be correspondingly smaller. So it's a sliding scale. But of course, on the positive side is that if you get to 50,000, that means that this becomes 1, which means you get the threshold plus half. So you'd get 350 plus 175, which is 450, it'd be 525. So if you've got a population of 50,000, you actually increase, so the threshold actually increases to accommodate the size of your economy, which means that you can import and export more, represents what the way the real economy goes. So let's just get back to here. Then we're now going to read through the paragraph. So hopefully this will be a bit clearer. It says, now let us show you some examples from in-game situations. Some players like to start by importing fabric and making clothes for exports out of that. I mean, this is quite a common exploit. A single fully utilized clothes factory can make 438 tons of clothes in a year, and you need to import double the amount of fabric for that. So if you would do that without having any population, then the threshold for the fabric import is 175 tons. Just to flip back to that. So if we go to fabric, again, this is the example. So what you're doing is dividing this by half, and then of course your clothes exports, which is 220 per 75 period, you'd also divide that by 2 as well. So it'd be 110. So if you would do that without having any population, the threshold of the fabric in the rubles is 175 tons. That's the figure we just got. And the threshold for exporting rubles is 110 tons. So that's the 220 for a 75-day period with no population. So you have to import 876 tons of fabric in a year, and it would be and if you would do that regularly using a truck, then you'll be going to reach the threshold, and the price movement will stabilize around 5% above the regular price, which means that you will pay an extra 5% for imported fabric until you do not lower them or raise imports. For exported clothes, you will reach 80% of the threshold, so you will get about 4% less value at the customs house if you will not change the amount. You will be exporting regularly. If this would not be there, you would have around 75% margin on the produced clothes. But this way, the margin will shrink by 10%, and then you will need to deduct the cost of transportation and workforce from that. We are talking about other clothes factory. You cannot be considered to be overproduction, but you would do the same with 2 clothes factories, then you'd lose 20% of the margin. So what they're saying is that if you do that and you exceed the thresholds, either by importing the fabric and a kind of exporting over the top, what that means is that your actual profit from that cycle will reduce by 10%, and if you go too far, by 20%. Which, if you consider, like they've mentioned, that if you've got your transportation costs, that will start to into your profit to the point where it will no longer be profitable to do it. I'm not going to go through the formula again. So we're going to go down and read the next example. Another example will be food production, because food has lower thresholds. You can produce 7,300 tons of food for a single food factory in a year at maximum utilization. That would need 15,330 tons of cargo to produce. That threshold for crops on the import side in rubles is 1,250 tons per 75-day period with no population. So if we go into the spreadsheet, if I show you here, they actually call crops plants. And what you see here is we can import 2,500 tons of crops, but of course divide that in half because we've got no workers. That's where the 1,250 comes from. And then of course it works exactly the same for the export side for food. If we go there and find food, you can see it's 200, and this is the export side, so it's 290 for food here. You can divide that in half and you get the 145 for a 75. It would import, if you would import all the crops needed to produce the food and exports, you would exceed the threshold by 250%, and then the exports of the food will exceed the threshold by 1,000%, which would mean that you would have to pay 13% more for crops and you'd get 40% less for food exports. You can clearly see this would not be a profitable thing to do. So what that means is that the old trick of importing crops to make food to export will be a little bit more dodgy. But if you can do it and stay under the thresholds, then that will be something that's worth considering. But it's certainly not an option if you are working with no population. Of course, here's the formula for the calculating the exports and output thresholds. I'm not going to go through them again, but I will read the small text underneath. Because you need to consider all imports and exports as the final balance is counted for each resource. The price change is applied to base price of the resources and not the previous trading price. No hyperinflation is due to the trade what happens as the base price is independent of trade prices. And what that's implying is that the actual calculation is based on the base price, not the trade price. So if you've gone over the threshold, increased, say, for your imports, and the price has gone up, if you go higher still, the next increase is still only calculated against the base price, so it's not compounded. One question I've got related to this is if you're using auto purchase. Now, I don't use auto purchase, but I think auto purchase, if you were using it extensively, could compound, because of course on top of the actual price, you've then got transport costs as well. So that could be something that's you may need to think about if you're using auto purchase for some goods as well. Now, one more example just to consider purely imported resources. So let's just say you have a republic with 25,000 workers to simplify things. That means that these figures are now their consistency. They need to have about 3,500 tons of food per year, which needs to be imported. you would import that regularly, then you would be paying about 22% extra for the imported food because you exceed the threshold by 300%. So what they're saying is that we're importing 3,500 tons of food. Now the import on this side, the second column. So yeah, so the cap threshold for 25,000 people is 350. What they're saying is that if you've got a population of 25,000 and you are importing all your food, it will put your price up by 22%. Just to reread this, it says you would import regularly, you would be paying about 22% extra for imported because you've exceeded the threshold by 300%. Yeah. But if you would be importing the same amount of food by ships and planes, you would pay only 7% due to the raised threshold cost. This is reiterating the fact that if you're using ships and planes, you get 3 times the threshold. So that is certainly going to make planes and ships a lot more viable option going forward. And I think this also applies to exports. If you're going to build a really strong export market, especially in what you would call the raw materials like food and iron ore or coal, using ships might be the better option, assuming that you've got ships on your map. So we're now just going to move down to the next paragraph. Hopefully this gives you a clue of how it works. The main change was to add scalability to the system, and the impact of trade was lowered because with the calculation going exponential, the number that can be extremely high and can be game breaking. Another thing which many of you may not be aware of is the inflation. Currently, the inflation for rubles and USD differs. Rubles has an average inflation rate of up to 10%, and the USD has an average inflation of 3%. Because of that, you may see the prices of both currencies diverging over time. The longer you play the game, the inflation calculates every 5 days, so that there's a little chance you will get too far from the median in a year, with 73 calculation cycles each year. There may be some deviations because there is a random change added each time into the price. Inflation is calculated from the base price, not the actual trade price, so you do not need to be afraid of hyperinflation. What they're saying is that the inflation is calculated every 5 days. I must admit, I didn't know that. And because the different inflation rates, the ruble and the dollar will diverge, and that will have an inverse effect on prices as well. That means that there's probably an advantage of with respect to building up a dollar trade for some elements of your market, because if the dollar's going up slower than the ruble, that means that and there may be more profit actually in importing or exporting to the dollar. Anyway, I'm not going to go into that too much, guys, because I think we're all developing a headache a little bit now anyway. So let's just finish off their report. So that was a lot of additional explanation, which made this report quite long to read, and we hope that it helps you to understand what is happening with prices. These trade prices changes are just temporary, and if you would not export or import anything in 75 days, or your trade would be neutral, trade prices reset to base prices. So it may be better to send one train twice a year to load at the border than doing it regularly with trucks. You do not need to worry about these changes for trade price calculations, because now the overall condition for players will be better than before, but you will be able to succeed before. You will do just better after the change, because these changes were made to address extreme price changes, and they should not occur as easily anymore. Now back to internal testing and timely public test release. Hopefully we'll be able to fix everything critical, and there will be any unexpected delays this month. Until then, enjoy your summer, have fun, and stay tuned for the next report. Now that's quite an interesting last paragraph, because what they're actually hinting at is a different approach. Because at the moment, as I say, I have to admit I'm a bit guilty of this as well. That you've just set a truck route up, and the trucks, and you have 5 or 10 trucks wandering backwards and forwards, continuously exporting. What they're implying is that if you have a bit of planning, and if you're using trains, or maybe even vehicles with higher capacities, because the actual price increase is calculated every 75 days, which is 2.5 months, which is, I'll round it to 3 months, which is 4 times a year. Say, for example, that you've got a product that is worth a fair amount, but it takes a little while to build up. there's an argument that what you could do is instead of sending a train down with, say, 30 tons on it, you load a train up and put 100 tons on it or more. So that, especially, I think this might relate particularly to gravel actually, or any of the more kind of basic resources. It'd be better to actually export a large amount in a 75-day period. The price will go up, but you will get the normal price. And then if you don't export for another 75 days, that price will drop down again. That's a very interesting mechanic. Now I would have to admit, I would have to think very carefully about how you would set systems up. You may have to actually have a system where you'd have a train set with wait until fully loaded, and then you'd have to have a distribution office that will send stuff to the train. But then how would you set it on a time period? I think I need to think about that, guys. And so this is where I'm going to leave it. Hope you enjoyed the video. Hope you found it interesting. Any opinions, questions about that, the anything in the report, feel free to chuck it in the comments. And hopefully we might have a little bit more of a discussion about this. So until next time, whatever you do, enjoy your gaming.